Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling heavier than when you entered it, wondering why your heart feels unsettled even when no harsh words were spoken? What if the constant anxiety, the emotional exhaustion, and the spiritual disconnection you're feeling have less to do with your circumstances and more to do with the people you've been trying to carry? And here's the truth we rarely want to face. Sometimes, the most dangerous presence in your life is not the one that openly hurts you, but the one that quietly drains you, all while wearing the mask of friendship. There inevitably comes a moment in life when you find yourself at a crossroads where you must choose between maintaining certain relationships and preserving the sacred gift of your peace. And in that moment, the clarity of your spirit begins to whisper what your heart has long tried to silence. Not every person who has walked beside you was meant to journey with you into your destiny. Some individuals were never intended to stay for the long haul. They were simply part of a temporary season, perhaps a meaningful one, even a formative one, but dangerous is the decision to turn a season into a lifetime, especially when that season was meant to teach, not to anchor. And when God begins to shake the foundations of what you thought was stable, when He sends storms that break apart what was never meant to endure, it is not your duty to gather the broken pieces and try to rebuild what was divinely torn down. Yet so many of us are weary and worn out, not because of the battles we've chosen to fight, but because of the burdens we've stubbornly refused to release. Burdens that often take the shape of people who were never supposed to accompany us this far. You may find yourself asking why, despite doing all the right things, your joy feels dim. Your mind is clouded, your spirit unsettled, and your sleep disturbed. And the answer, while painful, is often simple. It's not always your environment, your career, or your circumstances that are weighing you down. More often than not, it's the company you keep. The unresolved presence of someone whose energy collides with your calling, whose voice stifles your clarity, and whose presence undermines your peace. Many of us fall into the trap of trying to fix what God has clearly instructed us to release. We waste time and emotional energy trying to explain ourselves to people who were never truly listening in the first place. We bend our backs and spirits to accommodate those who, deep down, have no interest in our well-being. And perhaps the real tragedy lies not in their resistance, but in our refusal to let go. So let me ask you this: how many more times will you choose to endure emotional pain just to avoid the silence that comes with separation? How often will you sacrifice your inner stability for the sake of keeping someone close who has never valued the peace of your presence? That's not love, it's fear disguised as loyalty, and too often we confuse connection with purpose, when in reality, not every connection is a divine covenant. And as we begin to recognize the difference between those two, between connection and calling, we open ourselves to the deeper work God wants to do within us. In the next part, we'll uncover how to identify those subtle, often invisible signs that someone's presence, no matter how familiar, might be pulling you away from who you were created to become. Sometimes, when God begins to disturb your comfort, it's not because He's punishing you, it's because He's protecting you. He allows the discomfort to increase, the tension to rise, the uneasiness to stir in your soul, not to cause harm, but to gently push you away from something that was never meant to remain. Because He knows that if He doesn't allow the shaking, you'll settle. You'll normalize dysfunction. You'll call chaos your new peace simply because it's familiar. And you'll stay rooted in a place where He never intended you to plant yourself. And yes, letting go is rarely easy. Especially when your emotions are deeply tied to someone, when you've invested your time, your energy, your heart, and your history. It can feel like tearing away a part of yourself, like abandoning something sacred. But we must remember our future is far more valuable than the nostalgia of our past. We weren't called to live clinging to what once was, especially when what once was has begun to corrode our peace, our clarity, our sense of self. Too often we hold on to relationships, not because they're healthy, but because they're familiar. We convince ourselves that with just a little more patience, a little more prayer, a little more sacrifice, things might change. But the truth is, if the fruit is already rotten, continuing to water the tree won't bring it back to life. You are not called to preserve what heaven is trying to prune. You are not responsible for maintaining relationships that heaven has already marked as seasonal. And here's where wisdom must rise above emotion. Sometimes, walking away is not a sign of giving up, it is the first step toward healing. It's not an act of hatred, but of maturity. It's not a display of weakness, but a reflection of deep spiritual strength. Because in that moment of release, you're not just leaving behind someone else's dysfunction, you are making room for God to finally move. You are surrendering what you cannot fix and allowing the divine to enter in. And as you let go, something sacred begins to unfold. You begin to create space, not just emotional or physical space, but spiritual space for what is right to find you. The right people, the right peace, the right purpose. You begin to feel the lightness in your spirit return, like a slow but sure sunrise after a long and bitter night. You start waking up without the tension you couldn't explain, without the confusion that clouded your days, and without the weight of someone else's unresolved issues pressing against your chest. You see, you've been loyal. No one can deny that. You've prayed. You've forgiven. You've given not just second chances, but third, fourth, even silent sacrifices behind closed doors that no one else ever knew about. But now it's time. Time to release what your heart can no longer carry. Time to step back from what no longer belongs in your hands. Because sometimes, deep down, without a list of reasons, without a dramatic conclusion, your spirit already knows the truth that your mind is trying to resist. This is no longer where you belong. And if you listen closely to that still, small voice within the one God placed in your spirit long before confusion entered the room, you'll find the strength to keep walking. Because in the next moments, we'll begin to understand how discernment speaks long before logic catches up, and why paying attention to the shift in someone's energy might be the very protection you've been praying for all along. There's a quiet alarm that God has placed deep within each of us, a spiritual signal that goes off. Not with noise or chaos, but with subtle tension, a shift in energy. A heaviness that follows certain people into every space they occupy. And while your heart may still be loyal, while your mind may still reason and rationalize their presence, your spirit already knows the truth. That sense of unease is not paranoia. It's not oversensitivity. It's divine protection calling you to attention. You see, you can fake words. You can fake a smile. You can even fake concern or loyalty for a while. But what you cannot fake is the energy a person brings into your life. Their presence, what it stirs, what it awakens, what it drains, tells a truth that no speech ever could. And sometimes, you find yourself walking away from someone without a single argument, without a single disagreement, but still feeling strangely tired, emotionally foggy, or spiritually burdened. That is not a coincidence. That is your spirit responding to something toxic. And yet, we silence that inner warning. We dismiss it in the name of keeping peace, in the name of being understanding, supportive, or kind. We tolerate small comments that erode our confidence. We overlook side glances that plant seeds of doubt. We accept the passive silence of someone who never celebrates our victories and never speaks life into our dreams. We excuse these behaviors because they're not outright attacks, but the damage they do is slow, invisible, and dangerous. They drain you not with loud offenses but with quiet erosion. They don't tear you down directly, They chip away at your identity, one unspoken disappointment at a time. And what's even more dangerous is that they linger. They stay. They become part of your rhythm. And the longer they remain, the more you begin to believe that their silence, their detachment, their subtle discouragement is normal, even deserved. Why do we stay? Why do we allow this type of weight to linger on our souls? Often, it's because the familiarity is more comfortable than the unknown. We'd rather endure emotional suffocation than face the emptiness of walking away. We cling to what is killing our peace because the silence of separation feels more terrifying than the toxicity of staying. But let me ask you something that perhaps only your heart has dared to whisper in private. Moments, is being surrounded by chaos better than walking alone in peace? Is your loyalty costing you your identity? Are you sacrificing your clarity, your joy, your connection with God all to keep someone else from feeling uncomfortable? Because when your spirit begins to suffocate, when your energy is constantly being spent trying to manage someone else's instability, when your soul feels heavier after every encounter, that's not just emotional fatigue, that's your spirit trying to survive in an atmosphere it was never meant to stay in. When God is present in something, He brings peace, light, and clarity. When the enemy has a foothold, it shows up as confusion, heaviness, and inner conflict. And one of the most overlooked signs that someone is not good for your soul is not how they act when they're with you, but how you feel after they leave. So if you've been carrying a weight that has no name, feeling drained but can't explain why, maybe it's time to listen to the part of you that already knows. Because in the next part, we'll begin to uncover how your peace is often the first thing that suffers and why guarding it may be the most powerful decision you'll ever make. There's something profoundly sacred about your peace. It's not merely the absence of noise or conflict, but rather a deep well of strength from which your clarity flows, your prayers rise, and your purposes refined. And yet, far too often, we allow that peace to be sacrificed. Not in dramatic explosions, but through the slow erosion caused by conversations that go nowhere, by arguments that bear no fruit, and by relationships that continuously chip away at the truth of who we are. We trade our stillness for chaos in disguise. We allow our inner sanctuary to be infiltrated by people who don't value it, who treat our presence as a space to release their bitterness, their dissatisfaction, their unrest. And with every exchange, we give a little more of ourselves away. Not out of malice, not even knowingly, but simply because we haven't yet learned that peace is not a luxury, it is a necessity. To guard your peace is not to be selfish. It is not a sign of weakness or coldness. It is wisdom. Divine wisdom. Because peace is the environment in which your spirit breathes. And when it's under siege, everything else, your thoughts, your joy, your connection with God begins to unravel. Sometimes, God will allow discomfort to grow so persistent, so undeniable, that you can no longer ignore it. Not to punish you, but to nudge you into motion so that you'll move, so that you'll finally let go, so that you'll stop calling dysfunction normal. Because here's what happens when we ignore the signals and remain in places where peace has long departed. We begin to adapt to imbalance. We stop expecting harmony. We lower our emotional standards. We begin to confuse stress for passion, tension for depth, and chaos for connection. And slowly, we begin to live in a state of emotional survival, calling it love, calling it loyalty, when in reality, it's bondage wearing a familiar face. Letting go isn't always a single moment, it's often a painful process, especially when your heart is entangled in the history of someone you once believed would be part of your future. You remember the good. You hold on to the potential. You grieve not just what is, but what could have been. But here's the truth that will set you free. Your future is far too valuable to be held hostage by memories that no longer serve your growth. Just because something once made you feel alive does not mean it should still have a place in your life when it's now draining you. That season, yes, it had meaning. Yes, it had purpose. But seasons are not meant to be eternal. They are designed to shift. And when you try to turn a chapter into the whole book, you begin to live in repetition instead of revelation. If the tree no longer bears good fruit, if all you taste is resentment, fear, and frustration, then no amount of watering will redeem what is already spiritually spoiled. You are not obligated to continue nurturing what God has clearly begun to cut away. Heaven is not asking you to maintain what is misaligned with your calling, and perhaps this is the hardest truth to accept. Sometimes, healing looks like walking away, not because you're angry, not because you've stopped caring, but because your soul has outgrown the cage it's been placed in. It's not hate, it's not bitterness, it's not weakness, it's wisdom, it's spiritual alignment, it's freedom. And as you begin to walk in that freedom, you'll discover what happens when space is finally cleared, when the noise fades, when the burden lifts, and when God begins to send the people, the peace, and the purpose that were waiting for your obedience all along. When you finally let go of what was never yours to carry, something powerful begins to happen. The heaviness in your soul starts to lift, not all at once, but little by little, as though the weight of someone else's emotional baggage, which you've grown far too accustomed to holding, begins to slide off your shoulders. And that quiet freedom, you begin to realize just how much space was being occupied by pain that wasn't even yours to begin with. And it's in that moment that you understand freedom doesn't always come through addition. Sometimes, it comes through release. For far too long, you've been carrying someone else's chaos, mistaking it for your responsibility, convincing yourself that your love, your patience, your unwavering loyalty might be enough to change them, to save them, to restore something that has been draining you. But you cannot heal what someone else refuses to even acknowledge. You cannot continue being the one who gives, forgives, explains, and tries, while the other person simply takes and drains without repentance or growth. Yes, you've been loyal. You've given them more chances than you gave yourself. You've endured silent prayers, sleepless nights, and spoken tears, and countless sacrifices, all in the name of love, commitment, or duty. But now it's time to reclaim what you've been slowly surrendering: your peace, your identity, your voice. And the truth is, you don't need a long conversation to validate your decision. You don't need a dramatic exit or a list of explanations. You don't even need their understanding. Because deep down, something in your spirit already knows what your mind has been afraid to admit: that the chapter has ended, that the lesson is complete, that this person, regardless of how significant they once were, is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. Sometimes, you feel it before you can even put it into words. The tension, the confusion, the exhaustion that follows certain interactions like a shadow. Your heart is tender, your mind is wrestling with logic and emotion, but your spirit, your God-given discernment, is calm, clear, and unwavering. That's the voice you need to listen to. Because when someone's presence begins to weigh you down more than it lifts you up, when the atmosphere shifts from peace to pressure every time they enter the room, that is not random, that is spiritual misalignment. God never intended for you to confuse loyalty with spiritual suffocation. He never asked you to dim your light just to keep someone else comfortable in your presence. When someone's energy begins to feel heavy instead of holy, your spirit will always know, even before your mind catches up. And that discomfort, that inner alert, that's not your imagination. That's divine protection trying to get your attention. And once you start listening to that warning, once you allow your discernment to lead instead of your fear of loss, you'll begin to see the truth more clearly. In the next part, We'll uncover how emotional and spiritual exhaustion are often rooted not in your doing, but in what you're allowing. There are moments in life when your spirit begins to whisper louder than your surroundings. When the quiet ache of being misunderstood becomes a constant companion, and you start to feel the slow, suffocating weight of someone else's presence lingering in the air long after they've left the room. It's not about what was said. It's not even about what was done. It's about the effect, the invisible aftermath of consistently being near someone who subtly, but persistently, chips away at your peace. You've been in those situations, the ones where you walk away from a conversation not because of an argument, but because of how empty you feel afterward. You didn't fight. You didn't disagree. And yet, something about their presence left you confused and settled, spiritually dimmed, and still, you stay. Not because you don't feel it, but because you've learned to tolerate it, because it's familiar, because you've convinced yourself that what you feel must not matter as much as keeping the relationship intact. But let's be honest, for how long have you been shrinking to fit someone else's comfort? How long have you carried emotional burdens that were never yours to hold, all under the disguise of commitment, compassion, or Christian kindness? You weren't created to be the emotional landfill for someone else's frustrations. You are not the sponge for their unresolved trauma. You are not the sacrificial lamb for their bitterness, pride, or instability. And yet, the enemy knows he doesn't need to destroy you outright. He just needs to distract you, drain your energy, blur your vision, and anchor you to a relationship that looks innocent but slowly corrodes your strength. He often doesn't come with chaos. He comes cloaked in charm. He hides in patterns you've normalized. And before you know it, you're spiritually misaligned, emotionally exhausted, and no longer able to hear the still, small voice of God clearly. It's subtle, but deadly. You begin to hesitate when you once moved with confidence. You question your worth when you once prayed with boldness. You dim your light so you don't outshine someone who is secretly threatened by your growth. This isn't friendship. This isn't love. This is a silent war being waged against your soul, and the battleground is your peace. And the longer you stay, the more you begin to confuse being needed with being loved. But make no mistake, there is a profound difference between someone needing you and someone loving you. Some people don't value your heart, they value your usefulness. They stay close because you carry their burdens, fix their chaos, and absorb their storms. But that's not partnership. That's dependency masquerading as connection. And no, God never told you to be someone else's savior. That position has already been filled. You are not responsible for rescuing someone who refuses to take responsibility for themselves. You cannot keep bleeding for someone who won't even admit they're wounded. So now, you find yourself standing in the tension between compassion and self-betrayal. And here's where clarity must cut through emotion. If the cost of keeping someone in your life is losing yourself, then the price is too high. You were never meant to disappear in someone else's dysfunction, never meant to lose your purpose just to preserve a presence. You've stayed out of guilt. You've endured out of fear. You've tolerated toxicity under the banner of loyalty. But there's a holy line between grace and bondage, and too many hearts have mistaken endurance for obedience. God doesn't bless loyalty to what is breaking you. He blesses the courage to step into freedom, because it's in freedom that you rediscover your identity. It's in freedom that your ears open again to God's whisper. It's in freedom that your heart begins to beat in rhythm with heaven's purpose for your life. And you will never hear that rhythm clearly as long as your spirit is drowning under someone else's chaos. And in the next part, we'll step into that truth more fully to see how reclaiming your peace isn't just an emotional act, but a sacred decision that invites clarity, strength, and a deeper walk with God into every corner of your life. There's a subtle but dangerous deception that too many people have fallen into, the belief that to be loyal means to stay, no matter how much of yourself you have to lose in the process. It begins innocently enough. You tell yourself you're being faithful, you're being loving, you're standing by someone through hard times. And yes, loyalty is a beautiful thing when it's rooted in truth, in mutual growth, in shared grace. But there is a fine, holy line between loyalty and bondage. And when that line gets blurred, what once looked like love becomes a prison in disguise. Too many souls are chained to toxic patterns, convinced that suffering silently is somehow spiritual. That shrinking themselves to make others feel secure is somehow holy. But God never called you to a life of silent self-destructs. He didn't anoint you so you could bury your gifts, silence your convictions, or dim your light to preserve someone else's comfort zone. He called you to walk in truth, in boldness, in peace, not to be held hostage by someone who refuses to heal, refuses to grow, and refuses to honor the sacred space of your soul. You were created to thrive, not survive on scraps of attention, unconditional approval, or manipulative affection. And yet, in the name of connection, you've built a cage around your own spirit. You tiptoe through conversations that once flowed freely. You withhold your dreams because they dismiss them. You pretend to be less than who you are because your fullness intimidates them. And without realizing it, you begin to disappear inside the version of yourself they find easiest to control. But let me tell you this, God didn't call you to live trapped inside someone else's limitations. He called you to rise, to expand, to stretch your wings and soar into the fullness of your destiny. And no relationship, no matter how long it's lasted, no matter what memories it holds, should cost you your freedom, your identity, or your peace. It's noble to stand with someone through weakness. It's honorable to love people through their valleys. That's grace. That's compassion. But it becomes dysfunction when your patience is no longer strengthening them but weakening you. When your presence is no longer healing but enabling. Some people don't want to change. They don't want light. They don't want truth. They want control. And as long as you keep surrendering pieces of yourself, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left but the shell of who you used to be. This is not about bitterness. This is not about revenge. This is about recognizing the spiritual cost of staying connected to what God has already asked you to release. Some of you have been praying for peace, crying out for clarity, asking God to move in your life, yet you're still clinging to relationships that are robbing you of the very thing you're asking Him to give. You're exhausted, not because life is too much, but because you've made room for people who only bring confusion, who only plant insecurity, who only operate in guilt, silence, and emotional manipulation. That is not your portion. That is not the atmosphere God blesses. God is not the author of confusion. He does not move through guilt. He does not operate through fear. He leads with clarity. He speaks with conviction. He builds through love. So if someone's presence consistently leaves you feeling anxious, scattered, or unsure of your worth, pause, step back, ask yourself, what am I allowing that God never sent? You cannot continue to carry the weight of someone else's chaos and still expect to walk in peace. You cannot run toward purpose while dragging someone who has no intention of moving. And you cannot hear the voice of heaven clearly if your soul is always busy trying to survive emotional warfare on earth. There comes a point when you must stop blaming yourself, stop negotiating your boundaries, and stop pretending that the heaviness in your chest is just part of life. That heaviness has a name. And more often than not, it's tied to a person whose season in your life has expired. And so, in the final part, we will uncover what it truly means to reclaim not only your peace but also your future. Because letting go isn't just the end of a chapter, it's the beginning of a life where God writes the story, not fear, not guilt, not broken people. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when you must face the truth that not every hand you held was meant to walk with you forever. Some people were never called to your future, they were only sent to your past to teach, to test, to reveal. And as hard as it is to accept, the longer you stay tethered to what God is asking you to release, the more you delay your healing, your growth, and the fullness of your divine purpose. Letting go does not mean you failed. It does not mean you were unloving or disloyal. On the contrary, it often means you were finally brave enough to stop pretending. Brave enough to admit that no matter how much you cared, no matter how deeply you prayed, no matter how hard you tried, you cannot save someone who refuses to be free. You can love someone with your whole heart and still know they are not good for your soul. You can care deeply and still choose distance. You can forgive fully and still walk away in peace. Because love, true, godly, mature love does not require the sacrifice of your sanity. It does not demand you carry someone else's cross while they refuse to lift it themselves. And it does not ask you to abandon the light inside you just to be tolerated by someone living in darkness. For too long, you've confused survival with commitment. You've called it faithfulness when really, it was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of facing the unknown. But what you didn't realize is that in trying to save the relationship, you were slowly losing yourself. Your voice became quieter. Your spirit became dimmer. Confidence began to waver, and somewhere along the way, your peace disappeared, buried under the weight of someone else's chaos. But now, the light is breaking through, and with it comes truth. You do not have to stay in bondage to be loved. You do not have to shrink to stay accepted. You do not have to suffer in silence to be spiritual. You were made for more than emotional manipulation, more than spiritual confusion, more than codependent loyalty to patterns that dishonor God's purpose in you. You were made to walk in peace, in strength, in clarity, and above all, in freedom. And yes, letting go hurts. It may leave you crying. It may leave you wondering if you made the right decision. But with every step away from what drains you, you are stepping toward the one who restores you. You are opening your hands, not just to release the pain, but to receive the promise. Because when you finally surrender the weight you were never meant to carry, you make room for God to move. You make space for the right people who celebrate your growth instead of fearing it, who speak life into your calling, not doubt. People who don't just walk with you in comfort but who help lift you toward heaven when the valley gets deep. Let them go. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the fear. Let go of the illusion that holding on is somehow holy. And watch what happens when peace floods in like a river, soft, steady, and undeniable. Because the miracle isn't always in what God gives. Sometimes, the miracle is in what He removes. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, don't let it stop here. Take a moment to pause, breathe, and ask yourself, what weight am I still carrying that God never asked me to hold? Maybe today is the day you finally lay it down. You deserve peace. You deserve freedom. You deserve to walk in the fullness of what God has placed inside of you. And that begins the moment you say enough to what's been draining you and yes to what sets your soul free. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know whose spirit might be lifted, whose burden might be lightened, just because you chose to pass the truth forward. Leave a comment below. Let us know what spoke to you the most. Your story, your voice, your courage may be the very light someone else needs today. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more soul-shifting messages like this, because every week, we're walking this journey together, toward clarity, toward healing, toward peace. Thank you for your listening. Goodbye and see you in the next video.